The Luftwaffe aces shocked as Spitfire's elliptical wings surprisingly outturned Bf 109 seconds over Dunkirk. May 27, 1940. 2 o'clock in the afternoon, 8,000 feet above the smoking beaches of Dunkirk. Oberleutnant Werner Melders squeezed his control column hard right, pulling his Messerschmitt Bf 109 into what should have been an easy killing turn. He had done this 100 times over Spain, over Poland, over France. The Spitfire in his gun sight should have bled speed, should have wallowed, should have presented its belly to his twin cannons. Instead, it rolled impossibly tight, wings carving the air like a scalpel, and vanished beneath his nose. 3 seconds later, Melders felt the hammer blows of .303 caliber rounds punching through his fuselage. He dove away, engine screaming, blood trickling from a graze above his eye, and for the first time in his career, he tasted something unfamiliar: fear. Within 2 weeks, this moment would repeat itself across the skies of southern England, and the Luftwaffe, the most feared air force on earth, would begin to understand that they had not prepared for this. They had not prepared for the ellipse. The story of how a curved wing humbled an empire begins not in violence, but in miscalculation. In the spring of 1940, as German panzers carved through the Low Countries and the British Expeditionary Force scrambled toward evacuation, the pilots of the Jagdwaffe carried with them an assumption so deeply embedded it never required articulation. Their Messerschmitt Bf 109 Emil was the finest fighter aircraft in the world. It had proven itself in Spain, where it had decimated Republican biplanes. It had swept Polish PZL fighters from the sky in days. Over France, it had established air superiority so complete that Luftwaffe crews joked they were on a vacation tour. The numbers seemed to confirm their confidence. The Bf 109 could reach 354 miles per hour in level flight. It could climb to 20,000 feet in under 8 minutes. Its Daimler-Benz DB 601 engine delivered over 1,000 horsepower. Its armament, 2 7.9 2mm machine guns and 2 20mm cannons, outgunned nearly every opponent it faced. And its pilots, men like Melders, Adolf Galland and Helmut Wick, were combat veterans who had honed their skills in real battles while the Royal Air Force was still flying training exercises over the English countryside. When intelligence reports began filtering back to Luftwaffe headquarters describing a British fighter with unusual performance characteristics, the response was dismissive. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, had already publicly declared that no enemy aircraft could match German engineering. His subordinates agreed. The Spitfire, they reasoned, was likely another variation of the Hurricane, which German pilots had encountered and found competent but unremarkable. British fighters, the prevailing wisdom held, were defensive weapons built for endurance and patrol, not for the aggressive, slashing attacks that characterized modern air combat. The elliptical wing shape that defined the Spitfire's silhouette was noted in reconnaissance photographs, but its significance was lost in translation. German aeronautical engineers understood wing loading and aspect ratios in abstract terms, but they had not yet connected those principles to the brutal calculus of turning radius at combat speeds. They would learn soon enough. The Supermarine Spitfire Mark I was, in the language of its creators, a thoroughbred. Designed by Reginald Mitchell, a tubercular genius who would die of his illness in 1937 before seeing his creation in combat, the aircraft represented a philosophical departure from conventional fighter design. Where most contemporaries prioritized straight-line speed and firepower, Mitchell obsessed over maneuverability. His elliptical wing, a compound curve that tapered from root to tip in both chord and thickness, was aerodynamically perfect. It generated lift with minimal induced drag, allowing the Spitfire to maintain energy in turns that would bleed speed from any other aircraft. The wing's thin profile, just 13% thickness to chord ratio, reduced drag at high speeds. And the wide-set undercarriage, retracting outward into the wings, provided stability during takeoff and landing while keeping the fuselage narrow and sleek. The result was an aircraft that felt alive in the hands of its pilot, responsive to the smallest input, forgiving of mistakes, and capable of maneuvers that seemed to violate the laws of physics. But beauty came at a cost. Each elliptical wing required over 13,000 individual rivets. The compound curves could not be stamped or pressed by machine. They had to be formed by skilled metalworkers, each panel carefully shaped and fitted. Production was agonizingly slow. In 1939, Supermarine delivered only 2 Spitfires per week. Even after the outbreak of war, when factories shifted to round-the-clock operations, monthly output struggled to exceed 70 aircraft. By contrast, Germany was producing over 200 Bf 109s per month. The disparity was visible in squadron strengths. When the Dunkirk evacuation began on May 26, 1940, RAF Fighter Command could muster only 60 Spitfires for defensive patrols, compared to over 200 Hurricanes and nearly 800 German fighters. The Spitfire was rare, precious, and untested in large-scale combat. Its reputation existed only in peacetime air shows and the optimistic reports of test pilots. The Luftwaffe had no reason to fear it. The first indication that something was wrong came during the opening patrols over Dunkirk. On May 27, 1940, 6 Spitfires from 611 Squadron, flying top cover at 12,000 feet, intercepted a formation of 20 Bf 109s, escorting Stuka dive bombers toward the beaches. The German pilots saw the Spitfires climbing toward them and immediately turned to engage. Standard doctrine: dive on the enemy, use superior speed to close the distance, fire a burst, and extend away before the opponent can react. Hauptmann Hannes Trautloft, leading the German formation, later wrote in his combat diary that he expected the encounter to last less than a minute. He selected a target, rolled inverted, and pulled through into a steep dive. His airspeed indicator climbed past 400 miles per hour. The Spitfire, still climbing, should have been helpless. But as Trautloft opened fire at 400 yards, the British pilot executed a barrel roll so tight that Trautloft's cannon shells passed harmlessly behind. Before Trautloft could pull out of his dive, the Spitfire had reversed, climbed back to his altitude, and was sitting on his tail. Trautloft kicked his rudder hard, skidding sideways, and dove again, using his altitude advantage to escape. He returned to base shaken. His wingman did not return at all. That evening, debriefing officers at Luftwaffe bases along the French coast recorded similar accounts. Pilots described British fighters that could turn inside the Bf 109's turning circle, that could sustain high-G maneuvers without stalling, that could climb at angles that seemed suicidal. One pilot, Lieutenant Franz von Vera, claimed his opponent had reversed direction in less than 3 seconds, a maneuver that should have torn the wings off any aircraft. Another reported that a Spitfire had followed him through a vertical dive, matching his speed and firing continuously, forcing him to pull out so hard that he blacked out and woke to find his windscreen cracked from overpressure. The reports were compiled, analyzed, and forwarded to Berlin. Goering's staff dismissed them as exaggerations born of combat stress. The Spitfire, they concluded, was likely a good aircraft flown by skilled pilots, but it could not fundamentally challenge German air superiority. The numbers still favored the Luftwaffe. Losses over Dunkirk, while higher than expected, were acceptable. By June 4th, when the last British troops evacuated, the Luftwaffe had lost 43 fighters over the beaches. The RAF had lost 39 Spitfires and 57 Hurricanes, a draw perhaps, but not a defeat. The men who flew the Spitfires saw it differently. Flight Lieutenant Alan Deere, a New Zealander with 611 Squadron, described the aircraft as the only fighter in the world that allowed the pilot to outthink the enemy rather than simply outfly them. In his memoir, written decades later, Dear recalled his first engagement over Dunkirk with a clarity that suggested trauma as much as triumph. He had been bounced by two Bf 109s while climbing to altitude. The German leader opened fire at long range, forcing Dear into a defensive turn. Dear rolled left, pulled hard, and felt the Spitfire's wings bite the air. The horizon tilted, the G-forces crushed him into his seat, and when he levelled out, the two Messerschmitts were in front of him, canopies glinting in the Sunday. He fired a 2-second burst into the trailing aircraft. It exploded. The leader dove away. Dear climbed back to patrol altitude, his hands shaking, and realized that he had just accomplished something that should have been impossible. He had turned the tables on an enemy who had every advantage. Speed, altitude, surprise. None of it mattered. The elliptical wing had equalized the fight. To understand why required a descent into the mathematics of aerodynamics. Lift, the force that keeps an aircraft airborne, is generated by the pressure differential between the upper and lower surfaces of a wing. Air flowing over the curved upper surface travels faster than air flowing beneath, creating lower pressure above and higher pressure below. The resulting force pushes the wing upward. But lift comes at a cost. As air flows from the high-pressure region beneath the wing to the low-pressure region above, it spills over the wingtips, creating vortices, swirling columns of turbulent air that trail behind the aircraft. These wingtip vortices generate induced drag, a parasitic force that opposes the aircraft's forward motion. The greater the lift required, the stronger the vortices, and the more drag they produce. In a turn, where lift must increase to counteract centrifugal force, induced drag spikes, energy bleeds away, speed drops. The tighter the turn, the faster the aircraft slows. Every fighter pilot knew this. The Bf 109 addressed it by keeping turns shallow and using speed to disengage and reset. The Spitfire addressed it by eliminating the vortices. Mitchell's elliptical wing reduced induced drag by distributing lift evenly across the entire span. Unlike a conventional rectangular wing, which generated most of its lift at the center and created strong vortices at the tips, the elliptical planform tapered gradually, reducing the pressure differential at the wingtips and spreading the lift distribution smoothly from root to tip. The result was weaker vortices, less drag, and a higher maximum lift coefficient. In practical terms, this meant the Spitfire could sustain a tighter turn without losing as much speed. At 250 miles per hour, the Spitfire's turning radius was approximately 800 feet. The Bf 109's was 950 feet. That 150-foot difference represented the gap between life and death. A Messerschmitt pilot who tried to follow a Spitfire through a sustained turn would find himself outside the firing cone, watching his target pull away, unable to close the distance without slowing to the point of a stall. If he broke off, the Spitfire reversed and became the hunter. If he persisted, he bled energy until he became a target himself. There was no good option. The Luftwaffe's first systematic attempt to counter the Spitfire came in July 1940, when Goering ordered his fighter units to adopt new tactics. Instead of engaging in turning dogfights, Bf 109 pilots were instructed to use hit-and-run attacks, diving from altitude, firing a burst, and climbing back to safety before the British could respond. The tactic, known as boom and zoom, exploited the Messerschmitt's superior dive speed and rate of climb. It worked, to an extent. German losses dropped, but so did their kill rates. Spitfires proved maddeningly difficult to catch in a dive. Their low-drag wings allowed them to accelerate quickly, and their pilots learned to roll inverted and pull through into a split S, using gravity to build speed and escape before the German guns could track them. More frustratingly, the boom and zoom tactic abandoned the initiative. By refusing to engage in sustained combat, the Luftwaffe ceded control of the airspace to the RAF. British fighters could loiter over their own airfields, climbing to altitude and waiting for the Germans to attack. When the Messerschmitt's dove, the Spitfires turned to meet them, forcing the Germans to either commit to a disadvantageous fight or disengage and return home with nothing accomplished. For an air force built on the doctrine of offensive dominance, this was intolerable. By mid-August, the Battle of Britain had escalated to its peak intensity. The Luftwaffe launched massive raids, sometimes numbering over 1,000 aircraft, against RAF airfields, radar stations, and aircraft factories. The goal was to destroy fighter command on the ground, eliminating the Spitfires and Hurricanes before they could intercept the bombers. For 2 weeks, the campaign seemed to be succeeding. Airfields were cratered, hangars burned, squadrons were withdrawn from forward bases to safer positions inland. But the Spitfires kept appearing. No matter how many the Luftwaffe claimed to have destroyed, more rose to meet each raid. The truth, hidden from German intelligence, was that Britain's aircraft production had quietly surpassed Germany's. In August 1940 alone, British factories delivered 476 fighters, including 160 Spitfires. German factories delivered 377 Bf 109s. For the first time in the war, the Luftwaffe faced an enemy that could replace losses faster than it could inflict them. The statistical advantage manifested in attrition. On August 13, 1940, the Luftwaffe lost 45 aircraft. On August 15, 75. On August 18, 69. The RAF lost fewer fighters each day, but more critically, it lost fewer pilots. A German pilot shot down over England was either killed or captured. A British pilot shot down over England could be back in the air the next day. The math was unforgiving. By the end of August, the Luftwaffe had lost over 600 aircraft, including 230 fighters. Fighter Command had lost 426 aircraft, but its pilot strength remained stable. Replacement pilots, hastily trained but adequately skilled, filtered in from Commonwealth countries. Canadians, Australians, New Zealanders, Poles, Czechs. The RAF became an international force, held together by a common enemy and a common aircraft. The Spitfire was no longer just a British symbol, it was an Allied rallying point. Goering, watching his casualty reports climb, made a fateful decision. On September 7, 1940, he ordered the Luftwaffe to shift its focus from airfields to cities. London became the primary target. The rationale was strategic and psychological. Destroying London's infrastructure would cripple Britain's war economy. Terrorizing civilians would break public morale and force Churchill's government to negotiate. But the decision had an unintended consequence. By ceasing attacks on RAF airfields, Goering gave Fighter Command the breathing room it desperately needed. Damaged runways were repaired, depleted squadrons were rested and reinforced, and the Spitfires, no longer tied to the defence of forward bases, could concentrate their strength over London, where they enjoyed the advantage of fighting over friendly territory with short travel distances and ample warning from radar. The Luftwaffe had traded a winning strategy for a losing one, and the Spitfire ensured they paid for it. September 15, 1940. 1200 hours. The largest daylight raid of the Battle of Britain unfolded over southern England. 200 bombers, escorted by 300 fighters, crossed the Channel in 2 waves. RAF Fighter Command scrambled every available squadron. Over 250 Spitfires and Hurricanes rose to meet them. The sky over London became a tangle of contrails and tracer fire. Spitfires dove through the bomber formations, wings flashing in the sun, cannons hammering. Messerschmitts tried to intercept, but found themselves drawn into turning fights they could not win. Pilot officer Douglas Bader, leading 12 Group's big wing formation of 60 fighters, later described the scene as a medieval melee, a chaotic brawl where skill and luck mattered more than tactics. By the end of the day, the Luftwaffe had lost 60 aircraft. The RAF lost 26. More importantly, the bombers failed to hit their primary targets. Docks and warehouses burned, but the rail lines, power stations, and government buildings remained operational. The raid, intended as a knockout blow, achieved nothing strategic. 2 days later, Hitler postponed Operation Sea Lion, the planned invasion of Britain. The Luftwaffe had not secured air superiority. The Spitfire had denied it to them. The recognition came slowly, grudgingly. In the autumn of 1940, German pilots began referring to the Spitfire with a mixture of respect and dread. Galland, who would later become general of the fighter arm, wrote in his memoir that the Spitfire was the only aircraft he genuinely feared. He described dogfights where he had every advantage, altitude, position, surprise, only to watch his target slip away through a maneuver he could not follow. Mulders, whose victory tally would eventually reach 115 kills, admitted in a private letter that he avoided Spitfires whenever possible, preferring to engage Hurricanes, which flew predictably and turned wide. Troutloft, who survived the war and later helped rebuild the post-war German Air Force, said in a 1970 interview that the elliptical wing represented a design philosophy Germany never embraced. German fighters were built for speed and firepower. British fighters were built for survival. In the long run, survival mattered more. The numbers, compiled and analyzed long after the guns fell silent, confirmed what the pilots had felt in the moment. During the Battle of Britain, from July 10th to October 31st, 1940, the Luftwaffe lost 1,777 aircraft. Of those, 610 were fighters. Fighter Command lost 1,044 aircraft, including 520 fighters. But within those 520, the Spitfire's record stood out. Spitfires flew 38% of Fighter Command's sorties, but accounted for 42% of enemy aircraft destroyed. They downed 529 Luftwaffe aircraft while losing 361 of their own, a kill-to-loss ratio of 1.47 to 1. The Hurricane, flying more sorties with more squadrons, achieved a ratio of 1.2 to 1. The difference was the wing. In a battle decided by attrition, the aircraft that could survive an engagement and return to fight again shifted the balance. But statistics alone cannot convey the psychological impact. To fly a Spitfire was to feel invincible, not because the aircraft made you untouchable, but because it gave you control. Pilots described a sensation of merging with the machine, of thinking a maneuver and having the aircraft execute it before their hands finished moving. Pierre Clostermann, a free French pilot who flew Spitfires with 602 Squadron, wrote that the cockpit felt less like a workspace and more like an extension of his body. The control column responded to pressure so light it seemed telepathic. The ailerons rolled the aircraft instantly, without the lag that plagued heavier fighters. The rudder, massive and powerful, allowed pilots to skid sideways in a turn, tightening their radius even further. In the hands of a skilled pilot, a Spitfire became a scalpel, precise and deadly. In the hands of a novice, it was forgiving, gentle, unwilling to punish mistakes with a fatal spin or uncontrollable stall. It was, in every measurable way, the perfect defensive fighter. And yet, perfection came with a cost that extended beyond production delays. The Spitfire's range was limited. Its internal fuel capacity of 85 gallons gave it an endurance of less than 90 minutes at combat power. This was sufficient for defensive patrols over Britain, where airfields were minutes away, but inadequate for offensive operations over occupied Europe. Bomber escorts, deep penetration raids, long-range interception, all were beyond its capability. The Bf 109 faced similar limitations, but Germany's strategic position allowed it to operate from bases close to its targets. Britain, surrounded by water, needed fighters that could reach deep into enemy territory. The Spitfire could not. This limitation shaped the air war for the next 2 years. Until long-range drop tanks became available in late 1942, the Spitfire remained primarily a defensive weapon, protecting British airspace but unable to carry the fight to Germany. The aircraft that had saved Britain could not by itself defeat Germany. The Luftwaffe adapted. In 1941, a new variant of the Bf 109, the Friedrich, entered service with a more powerful engine and improved armament. It was faster, climbed better, and narrowed the performance gap with the Spitfire. German tactics evolved as well. Pilots learned to avoid prolonged dogfights, to use speed and altitude to dictate the terms of engagement, to strike when conditions favored them and disengage when they did not. The Spitfire remained superior in a turning fight, but turning fights became rarer. The air war over Europe became a contest of positioning, patience, and energy management. The side that controlled altitude controlled the battlefield. The Spitfire's elliptical wing, so decisive in the close-quarters battles of 1940, became one advantage among many in a more complex strategic equation. But the legend persisted. In the public imagination, the Spitfire became synonymous with British resistance. Propaganda posters depicted it as a knight's lance, defending the realm against the dragon of fascism. Churchill, in his speeches, credited the few, the pilots of fighter command, with saving civilization. The aircraft itself became an icon, recognizable even to those who had never seen one. Its silhouette, wings curved like a bird of prey, appeared on coins, stamps, and war bonds. Children built model Spitfires from balsa wood and paper. Women working in munitions factories pinned Spitfire brooches to their overalls. The aircraft transcended its function and became a symbol of defiance, proof that courage and ingenuity could triumph over brute force. It was, in the words of historian Len Dayton, the perfect weapon for a nation that believed it was fighting for its survival. Post-war analysis complicated the legend without diminishing it. Engineers studying captured Luftwaffe documents discovered that German aerodynamicists had, in fact, understood the advantages of elliptical wings. They had rejected the design not out of ignorance but practicality. The Bf 109's trapezoidal wing was cheaper, faster to produce, and easier to repair in the field. For an air force expecting to fight a short war, these considerations outweighed the marginal gain in maneuverability. The German calculation proved correct for Poland, for France, for the Low Countries. It failed over Britain because Britain refused to fall quickly. The Spitfire, expensive and slow to build, was the weapon of a nation preparing for a long war. It was not the best fighter of 1939 or 1940 by every metric, but it was the best fighter for the war Britain had to fight. That distinction mattered. The legacy extended beyond the war. In 1947, a Supermarine Spitfire Mark 24, the final production variant, set an unofficial world speed record for piston engine fighters, reaching 483 miles per hour in level flight. In 1948, Spitfires served with the Royal Air Force in Malaya, flying ground attack missions against communist insurgents. In 1954, the last operational Spitfires retired from RAF service, replaced by jets. But the design principles Mitchell had pioneered, the emphasis on low drag, high lift-to-weight ratio, and pilot-friendly handling, influenced every subsequent British fighter. The Hawker Hunter, the English Electric Lightning, even the modern Eurofighter Typhoon, all trace conceptual lineage back to the elliptical wing. Mitchell never saw his creation in combat. He died of tuberculosis in June 1937, 3 years before the Battle of Britain. But his obsession with perfection, his refusal to compromise aerodynamics for ease of production, created an aircraft that did more than win battles. It shaped the identity of a nation. In 2006, a restoration team in England returned Spitfire Mark 1K 9906 to flying condition. The aircraft, built in 1940 and flown during the Battle of Britain by 611 Squadron, had been discovered in a farmer's field, corroded and incomplete. Restorers spent 14 years fabricating replacement parts, sourcing original components, and hand-forming new elliptical wing panels using the same techniques employed in 1939. When the aircraft flew again, the test pilot reported that it handled exactly as the veterans had described: light, responsive, alive. He performed a series of tight turns at low altitude, and observers on the ground said the aircraft seemed to carve the air, leaving no wasted motion, no excess energy. It was a machine built for a purpose that no longer existed, yet it still performed that purpose flawlessly. The pilot landed, climbed out, and said simply that he understood now why the Luftwaffe had been shocked. Some technologies transcend their era. October 1995, RAF Duxford. The Imperial War Museum hosted a reunion of Battle of Britain veterans. Among the attendees was Hauptmann Johannes Steinhoff, a Luftwaffe fighter pilot who had flown Bf 109s over Britain and survived to become a general in the post-war German Air Force. He met Geoffrey Wellham, a former Spitfire pilot with 92 Squadron, for the first time since the war. The two men, both in their 70s, walked out to the flight line where a restored Spitfire sat warming its engine. They stood together in silence, watching the propeller blur into invisibility, listening to the Merlin engine's deep roar. Steinhoff said, in accented English, that he had spent 50 years trying to explain to people why his generation had failed to defeat Britain. He said the answer was standing in front of them, and no one who had not faced it in combat could understand. Wellham nodded. They shook hands. The Spitfire taxied past them, accelerated down the runway, and lifted into the grey English sky, its elliptical wings catching the light. For a moment it was 1940 again. Then the moment passed, and the aircraft climbed away, heading toward nothing, defender of a threat that no longer existed, eternal in its obsolescence. The wing remains. In aviation museums across the world, Spitfires hang from ceilings or rest on pedestals, their elliptical wings still perfect after 80 years. Engineers study them, pilots revere them, and occasionally someone asks why no modern fighter uses that design. The answer is complex, involving supersonic aerodynamics, materials science, and stealth considerations. But the simple truth is that the elliptical wing solved a problem specific to its time. It maximized lift and minimized drag at subsonic speeds in an era when air combat was decided by turning performance. Modern fighters operate in a different realm, where missiles engage beyond visual range and computers compensate for aerodynamic instability. The ellipse is no longer necessary. But for one crucial summer, when the fate of a free Europe hung on whether young men could turn tightly enough to survive, it was everything. Goering had promised his pilots they would face no opponent they could not defeat. Reginald Mitchell, dead 3 years before the first shots were fired, had already proven him wrong.